Hey parents, how do you make smarter choices for your kids' college today? That's where Sally can help. With Sally, you can find scholarships, funding options, tools, and guidance all in one place. And if you need a loan, Sally has options for different families and different situations. College is only worth it if you do it right. So don't just help your kid go. Help them go smarter. Sally.com/GoParents.
The best summer memories are made outside, and LL Bean has the clothing and gear you need to make these memories. Their effortless styles are created for summer spent outside with family and friends. Like hand-sewn boat shoes, coastal cotton sweaters, rugged polos, and, of course, the iconic Boatin' Tote, which has been made right here in Maine since 1944. LL Bean. Be an outsider. Visit llbean.com to learn more.
Hi, Nat Doig here, and just a heads up, as you might have guessed, today's episode deals with disease, death, and pandemics. Welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful, and a little off-kilter in the town of Biggleswade and its surrounding area. Whether you like your history with a pinch of the paranormal, or your paranormal stories with historical context, this is the show for you. Whether it's the tale of haunted Houghton House, or the Glenn Miller mystery, or maybe Victorian murder mysteries are your thing, make yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax while I take you on a journey into the weird. It's late August 1349, hot, the dog days of summer. Heavy black clouds loom on the horizon. The air is thick with the buzzing of flies, the scritching of grasshoppers, and the wind slithers through the dry and brittle grass in a hiss. Joan, a nun, is far from home. In front of her stretch long strips of fields. Wheat is rattling in the breeze, dried yellow in places and sprouting. Some of the crop is blackened with disease. Like so many of the fields Joan has passed on her journey, no one has harvested these crops. No one can. No flour will be milled and no bread baked. There is no one left here to eat the bread. Joan shudders. She falls to her knees and she is unsure whether it is in prayer or grief. But she stays kneeling at the side of these fields, almost luxuriating in the grief which she can at last express, now that she is alone. She has left her two companions back at the priory, two brother monks from her home in Sempringham, who have travelled with her south to Chicksands in Bedfordshire, another Gilbertine house, where her skills and her knack of survival are needed. Joan was relieved in the end to be sent away. To aid our brothers and sisters in the south with healing and tending of the sick, or at least that's what the official reason was given. But Joan knew that her fellow sisters and brothers had started to give her quick, furtive glances at prayer, at meal times or in the infirmary. They whispered in corners and stopped their chatter when she walked into a room. Sister Joan just never got sick. She never succumbed to any fever, not even the pestilence which had ravaged through the country, cutting down young and old, rich and poor alike. Yes, of course, it was the poor who always suffered the most, but this plague was greedy and would take down whoever came in its path, just not Joan. Of course, there were others who got sick and survived. There were others who the pestilence did not touch. But none worked as closely with the sick as Joan did. No one who spent time like she did with the very poorest and the most ill and ailing survived and thrived like Joan did. Some even whispered that Joan became brighter, bonnier, and generally stronger the more who died around her. Nonsense, of course. Not true. But there'd always been something about the almost gold of Joan's eyes that set her apart, that made some people wary of her. There was a poise in her step, a way of holding herself tall, that meant she never seemed to be accepted or at least embraced by the community. Even in the Priory, she stood out as somehow different. But Joan can't stay by the side of the fields crying or praying or both. She gets to her feet and she dusts down her habit, sweat trickling down her back as she trudges on, though she knows what she will find. The fields are the first clue, seeing them untended, unharvested. There are peas and beans overrunning in other fields. It's clear that no one has been well enough or alive enough to harvest since midsummer. Joan is determined to press on. She has seen so many hamlets and even villages deserted like this on her journey south. Saw so many fields overrun with weeds and dying crops, houses empty, skin and bone dogs running in packs through the dust of the empty streets. She needs to see for herself that this is what has befallen Cainhoe. Joan and her companions came across survivors on the road, stumbling on to larger settlements. Occasionally they found some stubborn, heartbroken people still clinging on to their homes and their lives in these abandoned ghost places, trying to get their crops in, determined to survive. But who would grind their corn if the mill owner was dead? Who would shoe their horse if the blacksmith was dying? Joan shudders, but she must see for herself. Until she sees that the blacksmith's at Cainhoe is shut and abandoned, she will not give up hope. She will pray for a miracle because Joan's sister is married to the blacksmith at Cainhoe. The first house of Cainhoe, a kind of gatehouse to the manor, looms ahead of her, grey against an even darker sky. It's shuttered and seems still. On approaching the house, Joan sees that the front door is ajar. As she gets closer, movement startles her, but it's just the door swinging in the breeze, creaking eerily. Joan tentatively pushes that door open a little wider and peers into the gloom of the room. Cobwebs drape the scene. A stool is on its side and the table has been pushed from its central position. The hearth, long cold and dead, gapes like a parched and dusty mouth. A chest has been smashed by the stairs and some linen is crumpled beneath it. Joan shakes her head. In some places they found the houses of the dead had been ransacked like this. In others, they were perfectly preserved, as if the occupants might walk in any moment and reclaim their cobwebby and dusty belongings. Joan walks on, past the manor. It's clear that no one is at home. The large building is missing its grand front door. The bakehouse is equally quiet. No enticing smells of bread and pies can be detected. The stables are empty of horses, either stolen, moved on, or dead. And there, the last house past the stables is her sister's. There is no sound of the blacksmith's hammer, no fire nor smoke coming from the yard or workshop. Joan stops. She sees beside her by the stables a broom, of all things, its twigs thick for sweeping. She picks up the tool and begins to walk towards what was her sister's home. She is struck with the fancy to sweep it one last time as an act of domesticity for her sibling. Before she can get close to the house, though, she hears both a terrifying and wonderful sound. A scream. In fact, screams. A young woman, but no more than 20 she appears, is dressed cleanly and somberly and is standing in the blacksmith's yard screaming at Joan as if Joan is the devil himself. Edith knew it was a mistake to come back. She knew it. The day was so hot, the sky heavy, pressing down on her, the air so thick. She felt like she was breathing through a sack. But come back she did, to her childhood home. She had only left 3 months before in the spring, had only gone as far as the next village over to Clophill. But, now newly widowed and unsure of where she would go next, if anywhere, she wanted to be back at that house she had grown up in. Seeing the village abandoned made Edith feel sick, as if her insides were crawling with maggots. The fields were overrun with weeds and overripe crops turning to seed and decay. She half fancied getting a scythe to at least her parents' strip, but there was no point. They were in Bedford now, where her father's smithing skills were so desperately needed. It was the same in her old home. There was nothing to do with the dusty cobwebs, so instead she had sat in her father's yard, his tools gone, the fire never to be lit again. She sat on the big stone trough, now empty of water, and bent her head. Her mind wandered to images of her husband, her sweetheart Ralph, who had succumbed to the pestilence just 3 weeks earlier. But Edith remembered him laughing over a cup of beer the year before, when they were just still sweethearts. Their wedding in the spring had been a rushed affair when the plague was forcing everyone to make plans hastily. But those thoughts soon slipped from her mind, and she looked up suddenly alert. Had she heard something? Edith peered out along the road, and there, plodding through the village, was a woman, a lone woman, in a dark cloak, walking steadily towards her. Edith froze. She did not want to be seen. Where she sat in the shade, she hoped that she would blend in with the darkness behind her. But it wasn't just a desire for secrecy that made Edith feel so uncomfortable. It was something she'd heard said just a few nights before. Edith had met a man at the inn who had travelled up from London. No one cared anymore where you travelled from. That stage of the plague was well and truly over. The pestilence was everywhere now. It didn't matter where you went or where you came from. There was no escaping it. Everyone had been struck by the pestilence, either by death, illness, or grief. So she had listened to this man's tales. He claimed London was over the worst of the plague. Yes, many still died, but no longer 200 a day being buried. More like 50 a day, he claimed. The stench from the pits and the graveyard was still bad, but more bearable than it had been. How he knew such figures, she did not know. And no one asked. London was London. Who knew what went on there? But he then had begun to tell tales of a more unsettling nature, if that was possible. Edith had listened amazed that anything could be worse than a man saying 50 people being buried a day meant things were getting better. But his story was one of superstition and dread. He had heard it from a Northman, he said, a man from the fjords and mountains, where the Vikings had once lived. This man had come to London recently and had confirmed that the pestilence had arrived in his country on a boat in Bergen. A boat full of ghosts. The ship had sailed into port, and off it had stepped one old woman, swathed in a black cloak. Everyone else on that ship was dead. The wives who were waiting for the return of their husbands found only corpses. In the wailing and crying of grief, no one stopped to think why this old woman had survived the plague. Who was she, and where had she gone? But after that ship of death arrived in Bergen, this old wizened woman was seen in nearby villages and towns. She would walk through a place wrapped in a ragged black shawl, her face shaded by the hood. But if you saw her face, not only was it etched with age, wrinkled and pale, but where her eyes should be, there was nothing but dark, fathomless holes. Those unlucky enough to see her would be struck down with the plague, the pestilence, or as they called it in the northern lands, Pester, and that became her name, Pester, the hag. Pester was feared by everyone. She could appear at your door at any time of night or day. They said that if she was glimpsed at your house with a rake in her hand, then some of the household may survive the plague. But if the old hag arrived at your door with a broom, your whole household was doomed. The story had made Edith shiver. Many in the inn had laughed and called it a foreign superstition. Others said, why couldn't the Reaper be an old hag? So that story, that horrible tale, was fresh in Edith's mind as she spied this cloaked woman walking towards her old abandoned home. The old woman paused at the old stable block, and to Edith's horror, she picked up a broom. A broom! Edith screamed and screamed and screamed as if all the grief she had inside her was erupting in that scream. But the old woman just carried on, walking steadily towards Edith, dragging that broom behind her. As she drew near, Edith froze. She could not move. The woman's face was old, but not wizened. The woman was dressed, Edith realised, as a nun would dress. Her face looked kind and almost familiar, and she did have eyes. Slowly, the screams died away from Edith's mouth. She couldn't get enough air into her lungs to scream any longer. Then the woman was upon her. Edith thought that she was about to die. She could not get any air into her lungs. But instead, the woman spoke calmly, in a voice so similar to Edith's mother's that Edith tried yet again to gasp for air in her confusion and could not. Dear child, breathe slowly. I am not going to hurt you. I am no ghost. Here, let me look at you. Look at me, girl. See? I am not going to harm you. Edith could feel this woman's touch was not cold, not ghost-like nor hag-like. This was no pester. Edith looked into the woman's face. The green eyes flecked with gold were like her eldest sister's. Her sister, Joan, who was named for their mother's sister. The nun spoke again. Are you Edith? Yes. Yes, I am, she said, wonder rising in her chest, replacing the fear with fluttering hope. Then I am your aunt. I am Joan. I've come from Sempringham. The last time I saw you, I think you were less than 8 summers old. The women fell into each other's arms and hugged for a very long time, a rare reunion amongst the death and desolation. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today we are confronting a plague, the 14th century pestilence or Black Death, as part of a series about abandoned and lost places and the eerie stories attached to them. This episode will explore Cainhoe near Clophill, Old Linslade in South Bedfordshire, and the settlement of Kinwick near Biggleswade, all former thriving communities which were devastated by the Black Death. Last time we looked at the ruins of House and House and the former castles of Biggleswade and Ampthill. And next time, we'll be looking at the creepy ghost stories and urban legends which swirl around more modern abandoned places. But it became clear as I researched abandoned settlements that the 14th century outbreak of plague really left its mark on Bedfordshire's geography. And so I decided to dedicate a whole episode to this grim chapter in our history. I will return to the later outbreaks of plague in a future episode, but today I will be focusing on the 14th century. Before I crack on with the rest of the episode, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who made it to Bedfordshire's Dark History Show at the Bed Fringe. Ollie Campbell and I had a wonderful time, and I really enjoyed chatting to a few of you afterwards as well. Now, if you missed that show, don't worry. Ollie and I will be bringing the Clophill Legends part of the show to the big theatre in Biggleswade in December. We're teaming up with Brian Bland from Ampthill Ghost Walks once more to create a Ghost Stories for Christmas show. Pop the date in your diaries for Sunday the 20th of December. There'll be a 4 p.m. matinee and an 8 p.m. evening show on that day, and I'll let you know as soon as I can about tickets when they go on sale. Also, please do listen until the very end of this episode if you'd like to get some recommendations for 2 shows to see at the Edinburgh Fringe this summer. One of the shows features Emily L. Watts, who you will have heard on Weird in the Wade, playing various characters, including in the Tempsford Hall, Black Humphrey and Preston Manor episodes. And I want to wish Emily L. Watts the best of luck. Break a leg, Emily. Also, just a wee reminder that if you'd like to hear episodes ad-free and get regular bonus content, then do check out the Weird in the Wade Patreon. Details are in the show description. But one of the best ways to support Weird in the Way is completely free. If you're enjoying these episodes, please do consider either rating or reviewing the show wherever you listen. It really does help the podcast get discovered. Thank you. And back to today's episode. The inspiration for our opening story. Now, you know I like to open my episodes with a dramatic, fictionalised retelling of either a piece of history, a ghost story, or a fragment of folklore. Well, today it was the latter. But I wove into that opening story a few ideas which will get explained more fully in this episode as we go along. In a moment, we're going to hear from Daniel Bowles, a historian and partnership and development coordinator at the Greensand Trust. He is our expert on the history of Cainhoe Castle and will talk us through the mystery of what befell Cainhoe. Sadly, he was unable to provide any evidence for the wonderful folktale which describes how a deserted Cainhoe village was discovered by a traveller. The settlement was trapped in time, deserted and empty, a literal ghost town, all living souls obliterated by the plague. But it's such a chilling tale, and one that persists into modern times with urban legends and true stories like the Marie Celeste ghost ship that fire our imaginations. In my reimagining of this old Cainhoe ghost village tale, I made the traveller a nun who was seeking her sister. I also took the liberty of sharing the Norwegian plague-based folk tale of Pester in the second half of the story. It's unlikely that the Scandinavian horror tale would have made its way to England by August 1349, but it is not impossible. We'll look at the progress of the Black Death shortly. The story of the Bergen ghost ship is another legend which persists about patient zero of the plague in Norway. Pester is such a visceral character, and not completely unique either. Death being personified as an old hag crops up in European folklore from time to time. In Eastern Europe and the Baltic, Pester is actually portrayed as a young woman. And at some point, I'd love to devote a whole episode to these death figures and omens, from the Grim Reaper to the bar guest to Pester and her sisters in folklore. And they deserve an episode all to themselves. Pester also interests me as she is an example of a folklore character who is often described as being blind or eyeless. And I think in Pester's case, she is described as blind in a similar way to how Justice is depicted as blindfolded or blind. Pester did not discriminate, just as death comes for us all. Pester's blindness symbolises the indiscriminate nature of the plague, striking down both young, old, rich and poor. But I wanted to include the legend of Pester in this episode as the personification of trauma and tragedy fascinates me. Norway's experience of the plague was even more devastating than in England, with estimates of up to 60 to 70% of the Norwegian population killed. I read one account which describes bears nesting in empty churches because the villages and towns were deserted of human life. The plague. So what was the Black Death, and what was its effect on England in particular? The first thing to say is that at the time, in the 1340s, when the first documented pandemic of the plague swept Europe, it was known as the pestilence or plague, the Great Mortality, or just the Great Death. The evocative name, the Black Death, would come later in the 17th or 18th century, but I'll use it interchangeably as most English speakers use the Black Death to mean the plague during all of its great pandemics, and in particular the 14th century one. It is worth adding here that evidence for the plague in prehistory is emerging now with developments in ancient DNA extraction. But the 14th century outbreak was the first time that it was documented widely. So although there had been outbreaks of the plague in prehistory, this was the first time that we get really good documentary evidence about it. The disease is today called Yersinia pestis, or just the plague. And yes, it is still found in various parts of the world, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, Peru, and in very remote parts of the USA, where the disease is thought to circulate in some rodent populations. Not wanting to alarm any of my US listeners, but there was a case of a man in Oregon catching bubonic plague from his cat in 2024. The man and his pet survived. The plague is a bacterial infection, and it comes in 3 varieties. Bubonic, which attacks your lymph nodes, leading to black or purple buboes forming. And then there is the pneumonic plague, which attacks your lungs. This version of the disease can spread between infected people through coughs and sneezes. The third kind is septicemic plague, which affects the blood and causes your tissues to turn black and die. No form of this disease is pleasant. Today, around 600 cases of the plague are reported a year globally. If you contract the disease and receive antibiotics today, you have a 90% chance of survival. If you don't get treatment, then even in 2026, the plague will kill 70% of untreated patients. The good news is we do have a vaccine for the plague, and those who work or live in places with a plague risk can be vaccinated against it. But obviously, in the 14th century, no effective treatment existed. In the 14th century, it's likely that the plague spread through a number of means. Yes, fleas on rats, travelling on ships helped spread the disease from country to country and along the Silk Road routes. But transmission between humans was also possible through bodily fluids. And this disease seemed to come out of nowhere to the people of Europe. In the early part of the 14th century, there had been the Great Famine, which swept Europe as crops failed between 1315 and 17. There was also a disease at the same time affecting some livestock. So the century had already faced a calamity which had reduced and weakened the population. Then, in the eastern fringes of Europe, around the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, a disease emerged in 1347 along trade routes, which then spread across the rest of Europe. With recent developments in genetics, the quest to find a patient zero, a first person or people to succumb to the 1340s plague, became a more achievable quest. And in 2022, scientists pinpointed the plague's origin to Kyrgyzstan in the late 1330s through tracking down grave inscriptions marked with death by the pestilence and carrying out genetic testing on the teeth of those buried. The plague is said to have arrived in Britain, in Weymouth, in Dorset, in 1348. But it wasn't until the following year that the disease would sweep across most of England, Wales and Ireland. Scotland held off until the following year, when plague struck at its worst in 1350 there. Having so recently lived through a pandemic, I think we probably have a better understanding of how our ancestors must have felt. Interestingly, when COVID struck, interest in the Black Death rose considerably. There was monitoring of Google searches for the plague and Black Death, and it really shot up. Now, I know that during the first few weeks of COVID lockdown, I researched the Black Death as a way to keep myself busy. But of course, in many ways, what we lived through is very different to what our ancestors faced, though there are some parallels. Remember what it was like when COVID first struck, when there were no tests, no vaccines available, when we didn't know how infectious it truly was. Those first few bewildering weeks. Well, that's how it was throughout the whole time of the plague in the 1340s. No vaccines nor medication came for our ancestors, but they soon learnt that the Black Death killed, and it killed many. It's estimated that between 30 to 60% of the English population died. And why such a wide figure? Well, most now estimate it as nearer 50%, but also communities were affected differently. Some communities seem to have been wiped out, while others survived. As in modern pandemics, the poor, the young, the old, and those with other illnesses or impairments were more likely to succumb to the plague and die. But the Black Death was seen as particularly harsh. Its victims could be from any class of person and struck down at any age. Later, we're going to have a look at some genetic factors as well, as there's some really exciting recent research into this. But for now, I think all we need to know is that in 1349, plague in England was pretty much halving the population and incapacitating many, many more. But let's step away from the plague for a moment. Let's take a stroll in a lovely new nature reserve, which has opened in Clophill at Clophill Lakes. Yes, it's near to St Mary's Old Church, the Black Magic Church at Clophill. In fact, at one point before the current stone church was built, there was a wooden one, barn-like, and built by the Anglo-Saxons. But when the original wooden church was around 100 or so years old, it would have gazed across to another hill, and on top of that hill stood a castle. The castle of Cainhoe. All that remains today is a motte, as it was a Motte and Bailey castle, but the site is fascinating and beautiful. So I visited a few weeks ago and chatted with Daniel about the history of Cainhoe Castle and the settlement that grew up around it, and of course, how it was affected by the Black Death and more.
I should probably place where we are. So we're at Clophill Lakes Nature Reserve, which is a nature reserve in the Flit Valley in Bedfordshire, owned and managed by the Greensand Trust. We are an independent environmental charity. We work all the way along the Greensand Ridge, so from Leighton Buzzard up to Gamlingay, to celebrate what makes the landscape special, own countryside sites, engage with people and get people enthusiastic about nature and history.
Could you tell me, when was Cainhoe Castle built?
So this is going to be a typical historian's response in that we don't really know, but we're going to have a good guess.
Excellent.
So we do know that it was built or commissioned by Nigel Daubigny, or Dalbini if you want to anglicise it. He was a Norman baron, came over with William the Conqueror. In terms of when we think it was actually built, we don't have a precise date. We know that it was certainly before the year 1100, which is when Nigel died. So obviously between the Norman conquest and 1100.
Yeah.
Our best guess, it was probably the 1070s, 1080s, after that initial flurry of castle building on the south coast and before you got to sort of the bigger town castles like Bedford Castle. If you look at sort of a bigger scale about where other castles are, there's a phenomenon called the Chiltern Gap, which is a string of castles that you get, of which Cainhoe is one of them. So they, in this sort of more local Beds Herts area, you go from Purton to Meppershall, Cainhoe and Clophill to Flitwick and to Toddington. There's a row of castles all built roughly around the same time on natural high ground, and that's where Cainhoe was built, on a natural hill. Probably more a sort of a show of soft power than anything strategic. We know there were Saxons where the old church in Clophill now is. So those two areas of high ground, Normans facing the Saxons. The thing as well, we know that there were Saxons on Cainhoe before the Normans. Probably nothing mightily impressive, maybe a few sheep enclosures, something like that. But we know there was definitely a Saxon presence there before that anything was built castle-wise.
But what do we know about these de Aubigny family?
We know that they come from the Loire Valley in France.
Oh, nice.
So they, lovely scenery there. And
lots of lovely castles.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We know that they came over, or Nigel came over as a knight and supporter of William the Conqueror. Following the conquest, he was given a lot of the land around Bedfordshire, particularly around Ampthill. There were some outlying bits in the Midlands and Derbyshire that we know Nigel was given. There's some historiographical debate about his lineage. We know that related to that, his nephew was one of the first Earls of Arundel. So there was a lineage in the more distant family. So we know Nigel died about the year 1100. We know that his son Henry, very close to Cainhoe, founded a hermitage. This was built obviously in honour of his father, Nigel, and installed the wonderfully named Ralph the Hermit in the hermitage. They cleared some land and gave some woodland to support that hermitage, and eventually that was then bought or sold or gifted to the Abbey of St Albans. We know that once the hermitage was absorbed into the Abbey of St Albans, it became a much bigger priory. So Bewley Priory, not the Hampshire one obviously, but the Bedfordshire Bewley, and there was a dig in the 60s. They uncovered loads of the remains of the priory. Cainhoe is actually an example of a triple motte and bailey. The motte is the area of raised ground where the tower or keep would have been, and then there were enclosures, and in the case of Cainhoe, 3 enclosures around it, which were the baileys. There's some debate as well about whether Cainhoe was built as a simple motte and bailey to begin with, just the one motte and one bailey, or if it was all 3 together, using work such as making a topographical model to try and understand the lay of the land. We think that they all came at the same time from, using a natural hill, carving out ditches to make these separate enclosures and making the most of what the ground had already done for them.
Were there actually then 3 mounds?
So there's one motte with the keep or tower, and then the different enclosures or the baileys with stables, kitchens, blacksmith shops, all the stuff that you need to survive in Norman England.
And a bit of a village really built up around it, didn't it? Because of that, because you need a blacksmith, you need someone to look after the horses. They became a little community, didn't they?
Definitely. And when you look in the Domesday records, you see that there's 2 entrances. You have the entries for Cainhoe and the entries for Clophill. Again, some historiographical debate about whether the village of Clophill was actually around the old church rather than where it is now, and that Cainhoe was around the castle but also perhaps stretching as far as where the village is.
We really don't know.
We don't know, and unfortunately most of the archaeology has either been lost to the plough or where we're sitting now, 2 great big lakes where Fuller's Earth was extracted throughout most of the 20th century. In order to sort of understand how the site has evolved, obviously we've got the Norman castle, but one thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is in a way almost more interesting, is the fact we also have the site of what I hope is a moated medieval manor house on the site. We have contours of the castle, and then we have a really flat square area of land within the scheduled monument, which our best interpretations are that it was the site of a medieval manor house. When the castles became out of fashion. You know, the fashion was to have a wooden hall with a moat. You know, it was the de rigueur thing to get rid of the castle, take the useful timber that was still there and make something more fashionable. Again, we don't have specific dates of when castle was demolished, when manor was built. We know from some of the sort of court and will records that by 1272 what's called the Hall of Cainhoe is there.
Right, that sounds more like a manor, doesn't it?
It does.
Than a castle if it's calling it the hall.
And we've got descriptions that talk about having porches, chambers, cellars, bakehouses, gardens, and interestingly a fish pond, or fish ponds I should say, and those fish ponds are still visible on the site today.
I'm guessing then we're talking late 12th, 13th century that we've got maybe a manor here, and again the community, bakers, people that would have been looking after the fish.
Exactly,
you would have had, you know, again a community around that manor. It does disappear, doesn't it?
It does. So unsurprisingly the Black Death appears, both in the documentary evidence and in sort of local folklore. There are sort of tales that go around about a traveller wandering up to the site and finding a deserted village.
Yes, because this is what I read.
I'd love to be able to substantiate that as a really good narrative.
It is.
Unfortunately, I've got something a bit more banal in the inquiries at Ampthill. So the 23rd year of the reign of Edward III, which is about 1350, which fits perfectly for the plague. We've got reports of the manors of Cainhoe and Clophill where they talk about no rents of bondmen or cotters, so cottagers, because they are all dead through the pestilence. That's a pretty concrete evidence that the plague had a massive effect on Cainhoe, like it did at places like High Gobion as well. Whether or not this tale of this mythical traveller that's coming across an ancient village is true, we know from an income perspective, the manor of Cainhoe was completely decimated by the plague. Even in COVID, we saw how quickly things declined when they weren't being used. If you take that back to the 14th century, everything is timber framed, wattle and daub, thatch. Everything is so much less permanent that, you know, even a few years of inactivity would really change a landscape. And we know by court records in 1374 that Cainhoe is effectively in ruins, and that we've got records of people pillaging building materials. So
that's
really
only 30 years after
exactly
the way, because that was what, 1340 something, wasn't
yeah,
it?
exactly,
or something like that. Have there been any significant archaeological finds here at Clophill Lakes?
Yes, it's a really good question. First of all, the obvious thing is, you know, what can we see? The remains of the castle.
Yes.
And as it was, you know, timber and earth, not a lot. We are doing a lot of geophysical surveys to try and find post holes and that sort of thing, and that's the best we can hope for in terms of structures. In terms of finds, there was an archaeological dig done in the early 70s when the A507 bypass was being reworked. There's some really interesting things that came out of that dig. So the showcase piece really was a rondel dagger. Unfortunately, we've tried our best. We actually don't know where it is. It's deposited in a local museum somewhere.
What does the rondel bit mean? Do you know?
As far as I'm aware, I think it just means that it has a rounded end.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't a high status piece.
No.
It was, you know, your sort of Swiss Army knife equivalent, really. But it was intact when they found it.
Oh, amazing.
And I think it was one of only two. There's one found in Northamptonshire of a similar style.
Yeah.
Dated to exactly 1462, which is amazing how they can date it that precisely.
Wow.
So that's the most impressive find. In terms of other finds, lots of flints, unsurprisingly, and some horseshoes, which again,
Love finding
signaling
a
with
horseshoe.
that, you know, it was a transport infrastructure type place. Pottery, 93 shards of pottery found.
Wow.
You know, it wouldn't surprise me if you went up there now and saw in some of the rabbit holes if they'd, you know, so a bit of pottery had emerged.
Yeah.
And going back to that idea I said about the Saxon habitation before, there was some evidence of some wooden stakes found, which would again suggest that they were putting up temporary enclosures, something like that. And there was some carbon dating done on those, and they were all ash, alder, exactly the trees that you'd find in the bottom of the Flip Valley.
Yeah, amazing.
One of my primary interests is historic designed landscapes, and the Greensand Ridge there's so many of these what I call lost landscapes.
Yes.
So, you know, where you might get fragments of something that suggests a wider landscape design.
Yeah.
So where we are now, it's entirely possible that Cainhoe Castle was almost viewed as a sort of distant eye catcher for the Rest Park estate.
Yeah, of course.
So we've got, if you go down the 507, there's two wonderful sandstone pillars, which that was one of the historic carriageways to Rest Park. And Cainhoe Castle, very near to that, would have been a lovely little eye catcher. There's places like Linden House in Eversholt, which was a whole parkland in of itself before the Duke of Bedford bought it and absorbed it into Woburn. So there's still sort of a Serpentine Lake and one of the lodges that's still there. So you can pick out these little bits of landscape history, but they're not obvious. We talked about Gamlingay, the parkland at Gamlingay that's no longer there. Again, remnant of one of these great houses. Just with the earthworks left. The Greensand Trust, we also own and manage a nature reserve very close to Clophill Lakes called Sandy Smith Nature Reserve. And that historically was part of Chicksands Priory. And we've got some of these little tantalising little bits. So in a curve in the river, there's a wonderful London plane tree, which you just wouldn't expect in a bit of native woodland.
No, someone's planted that on purpose.
And some bits of a folly, and we've done some documentary research. We think there was a root house in the middle of a field.
What's that? Is that for storing roots?
No, it's more ornamental than that. I had no clue these existed. It's a little folly, eye-catchery, whimsical thing made of upturned tree roots with a little thatched roof on it.
Amazing, like a little hobbit hut.
Exactly, it's got Hobbit written all over it. So.
That's amazing. Oh, I love it. And is that still there, the root house?
It's not, no.
No, but you know that there was one.
Yeah, so we're trying to sort of pinpoint where it would have been on the map.
Well, that sounds like a cool thing to try and build.
Oh, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm going to build a root house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. So thank you so much, Daniel, for talking with us today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
That's been brilliant. Thank you.
After speaking with Daniel, his colleague Katie had a really intriguing model to show me. Now, there will be video of this model on weirdinthewade.blog, but here's my kind of description of it for you in audio. So, Katie, this is a fantastic model. Can you tell me a bit about it?
So this model is just such a great boon for us, because we had a volunteer who came along and wanted to make the model, and his name is PJ Zimmerlink, and he came in as our artist in residence, and we kind of locked him in a shed for about a month, and he came out with this. And so
can I just give a shout out to PJ, because he is a listener of Weird in the Wade and has been listening to Weird in the Wade since the very beginning. So hi, PJ.
And he's from Pennsylvania.
Yes, he's not even local. Yeah, this is how far Cainhoe Castle has travelled, and Weird in the Wade.
Yeah, so PJ came over from Pennsylvania. He was able to volunteer with us for 30 days. I think his visa allowed. And he came out with this topographically correct, I always get that word wrong, model. So he literally used is it LiDAR? He built it with sort of stratas of cardboard, and then I think it was plaster of Paris, and then he actually cast it in fiberglass, so it's quite solid. So have a feel of it, Nat, because it's I'm guessing this here, is this where the manor house was, this square bit? I think so.
Yeah. So you can, with this, you can see straight away, and I'm touching it. There's the square enclosure bit, and then if we go over here, this really brings it to life. The fact that that's got to have been one of the Baileys. Is that right?
Yeah.
On the top, because it's circular. But we've got another mound here.
Yes. It's really clearly... you can see the earthworks.
And the earthworks are amazing. So you can see where there would have been enclosures that would have had things inside them, whether it's the buildings, the Baileys. So are these the three?
This one here is one. Yeah. That's one. And this was one, the Victorians decided to quarry out a little bit.
Okay.
And these are the fish ponds as well.
And those are the fish ponds. Fantastic. I'm going to do a video in a minute, if that's okay.
Yes, but I also want to show you a little bit more.
Yes.
We tempted him back, and we're calling it a prosthetic, but I'm not sure if that's the right word.
This is amazing. It's coming out of a box.
Yes, a little hat, where he has, based on the landscape...
Amazing.
He has imagined what the actual castle would have looked like, and it fits... perfectly on.
It slots perfectly on, and now it covers it, and now you can see that we've got little buildings.
I think actually working with the land that's there enabled him to think about the scale in a way that we haven't really been able to kind of do for people, because everything that we think about on this site is an imagined past, because we don't have all of the information.
Love it. You can see where there was like a little bridge and a ditch going in, and then it's amazing. So I'm going to do a video, so you can go on to weirdinthewade.blog and have a look at that video, so that you can see it before the model is on and after we put the model on top, the prosthetic
the
model.
prosthetic.
But this is fantastic. I just love it. It's brilliant.
When it's time to scale your business, it's time for Shopify. Get everything you need to grow the way you want. Like, all the way. Stack more sales with the best converting checkout on the planet. Track your cha-chings from every channel, right in one spot. And turn real-time reporting into big-time opportunities. Take your business to a whole new level. Switch to Shopify. Start your free trial today.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
I'm not giving up. I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either going to be okay...
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
We'll probably never know for sure what happened at Cainhoe. Did the survivors join forces with other survivors at Clophill to make the most of it? The choice to abandon Cainhoe must have been hard. What was it about Clophill that made it more appealing as a place to survive? It wasn't just Cainhoe that was affected by the Black Death, though. Across the whole of the country, county and Europe, the plague tore through communities and changed the lives of survivors forever. Most of the detailed records we have of the time are from the monasteries. The monks were the chroniclers of their age. They were amongst the few who could read and write. Of course, their records come with the preoccupations of their role, God, religion, as well as the plight of their own brothers and those who worked the land for them. One Westminster monk, John of Reading, wrote a little after the plague this: "And there was in those days death without sorrow, marriage without affection, self-imposed penance, want without poverty, and flight without escape. How many who fled from the face of the pestilence were already infected and did not escape the slaughter." To translate his meaning here, I think he seems to be saying that so many died it became commonplace, and so just grief was lost. There was often no one left to grieve. People married in haste and not for love. Many tried to escape the plague through performing penance or personal sacrifices. Many who lost everything were not poor, and many could not escape the pestilence, even though they tried. It's a bleak picture. An Irish friar, John Klyn of Kilkenny, was even bleaker, possibly because he wrote the following at the time of plague, the time it was ravaging his community. This was written on the 17th of June, 1349, and it's the very last entry in the chronicle that he was keeping. The pestilence deprived of human inhabitant villages and cities, and castles and town, so that there was scarcely found a man to dwell therein. The pestilence was so contagious that whosoever touched the sick or dead was immediately infected and died, and the penitent and the confessor were carried together to the grave. Through fear and dread, men scarcely dared to perform the offices of piety and pity in visiting the sick and burying the dead. Many died of boils and abscesses and pustules on their shins or under their armpits. Others died frantic with the pain in their head, and others spitting up blood. That year was beyond measure abundant and fruitful, however sickly and deadly. Up to Christmas, 25 friars had died in the Franciscan convent at Drogheda, and 23 in the convent of the same order in Dublin. The pestilence was rife in Kilkenny. In Lent, for from Christmas Day to the 6th day in March, 8 friars, preachers, died of it. Scarcely one alone ever died in a house. Commonly husband, wife, children, and servants went the one way, the way of death. And I, Brother John Klyn, of the Order of the Friars Minors and of the Convent of Kilkenny, wrote in this book those notable things which happened in my time, which I saw with my own eyes, or which I learned from persons worthy of credit. And lest things worthy of remembrance should perish with time and fall away from the memory of those who are to come after us, I, seeing these many evils, and the whole world lying as if it were in the wicked one, among the dead, waiting for death till it come, as I have truly heard and examined, so have I reduced these things to writing, unless the writing should perish with the writer, and the work fail together with the workman. I leave parchment for continuing the work, if happily any man survive, and any race of Adam escapes this pestilence, and continue the work which I have commenced. As this was the last entry that Friar John made, it is assumed that he succumbed to the Great Death. His justified pessimism tolls like a bell through the centuries. So how did Bedfordshire fare? Well, we do have some records, not from monks, but from the churches, which help paint a picture for us. The vicars of Biggleswade have been recorded from as far back as the 13th century, and we know that the vicar in 1344 was Hugh Franklin, and he dies in 1349, most probably of the plague. He is replaced by Robert de Clifton, who in turn dies of the pestilence in 1369. Biggleswade was more fortunate than some other towns when it came to holding on to their vicars during the time of the Black Death. In Toddington, they lost 3 rectors to plague in the year 1349, and in Leighton Buzzard they lost 2. We also know that of Bedfordshire's 123 vicars or rectors, 54 of them died the year of the plague, and that's around 44%. Biggleswade survived the Black Death, though clearly, like everywhere, it will have suffered. But one of its neighbouring settlements did not fare so well, Kinwick. And I'm going to pronounce the Wick, but no doubt if this settlement existed today, we'd say Kinnick, like we say Flitwick and not Flitwick. Its name is Anglo-Saxon, meaning Cinnamon's Farm or Kinnamon's Farm. So they would have pronounced the Wick because it means farm. In fact, into the 14th century, it was probably closer in pronunciation to Kinnamon's Wick. Kinwick is mentioned in the Domesday Book in 1086. It is said to have a watermill, and we can estimate around 25 inhabitants, as it had 6 heads of household, making it a hamlet or small village. At the time of the Domesday record, the land was held by St Edmund's Bury Abbey in Suffolk. I'm guessing that's Bury St Edmund's Abbey today. But those of you local to Biggleswade may well be wondering, where on earth is this Kinwick, or where was it? Well, we have a couple of clues to guide us. First of all, there is a murder dating back to 1270. A record from the Bedfordshire Archives explains. After Vespers, evening prayers, on the 9th of October 1270, Gilbert the Shepherd of Kinwick went from his house in the hamlet of Kinwick, in the parish of Sandy, to his sheepfold, a furlong outside the town on the east, and did not return that night. His wife Rose searched for him with the neighbours, and on the next day through the neighbourhood, in towns and fields, and could not find him. On the 13th of October, 4 days later, Gilbert's son Hugh was watching sheep on Sandy Heath, and there he found his father, slain, being struck through the middle of the hatchel. The archives suggest that hatchel means either the crown of the head or the nape of the neck. Poor Gilbert had been slain, apparently bashed with an axe. The hue and cry was raised, which meant that the magistrate or constables were sent for. Gilbert's son was able to get 2 men of Kinwick, Ralph Wybert and Henry Blanfront, to pay a bond so that the inquest could be held and witnesses compelled to attend. The archives go on to explain. The inquest coroner was Geoffrey Rodland, who did not know who killed Gilbert or where he was killed, but they well knew that he was not killed where he was found. This is some 13th century CSI going on here. Now, I'm guessing they worked this out, that poor Gilbert had been murdered elsewhere due to the lack of blood in the area where Gilbert's body was found, and possibly because they'd already searched that area and Gilbert's body didn't show up until 4 days later. A number of the villagers in Kinwick, Potton, Sutton and Sandy were pledged to attend the assizes, or an heir, as the inquest was called. But it seems no one turned up, or at least not everyone who was supposed to, because the settlements of Sandy, Kinwick, Potton and Sutton are all fined for not attending. They are also fined for the murder, not because the coroner discovers who the murderer is. No, he says that Gilbert was slain by a person unknown. But in Norman England, if a Norman was murdered, then a fine was imposed on the town or village where it happened. If an English person was murdered, then there was no fine. This was known as the law of Englishry, and the fine was called the murdrum. It had been set up by William the Conqueror as a way of dissuading the English from rising up and killing their Norman overlords. It also sent out a clear message that a Norman life was worth far more to the crown and community than an English one. Of course, it also raised money for the crown. I can also imagine murdered bodies being moved to neighbouring towns to avoid the murdrum fine. Or am I just being too sneaky in my thinking there? I'm sure the murdrum fine was a plot point in a Cadfael book once. This law of Englishry was finally abolished in 1340, but still applied 200 years after the Normans' conquest when Gilbert is murdered. He clearly is considered to be a Norman, and the names given to the various pledgers who were supposed to make sure that witnesses attended court are also very Norman French names in character. We have a Hugh Rickeld, a Martin Petit or Petit, and Hugh Aubre, a Richard Muriel, and a William Le Marchand. I think the story of Gilbert the shepherd's murder, his wife's search for him, and the neighbours refusing to talk at the trial makes for a fantastic plot for a historical novel. I wish there was a way to find out more about this case. I will investigate further, though I am not sure what else can be discovered. I also think that it's intriguing that this murder, the site of the Phantom Army, which we covered last year on previous episode, as well as later murders that I have referred to in episodes, and other eerie happenings have all occurred on this piece of land that includes Biggleswade Common and the land to its east. This tragic medieval murder tells us, though, that Kinwick was an established settlement. It was to be found between Sandy, Sutton and Potton, and that it's likely to be close to Sandy Heath, as that's where Gilbert was working, tending his flock. We also know that he was a shepherd for Chicksands Priory, the Gilbertine Priory, some 8 or 9 miles away. Amongst the witnesses who were pledged for the inquest, there's another shepherd named Peter as well. Our final clues to where Kinwick was situated come in the form of a relic in the cartography of our landscape. A Kinwick field is mentioned in the records, and in 1804 Kinwick Field is enclosed land owned by Hugh Pym, the local landowner. It's found north of the Potton Road, alongside to the east of Biggleswade Common, just south of Sandy Warren, and includes Watermill Fen, and it is just north of Watermill Bridge. Or yes, Murder Bridge. Yes, the bridge that poor Eliza Lawson's body was found under in the 19th century. I'll link to the map on the show blog that has the field marked on it. You'd never know today, other than in the name of Watermill cropping up, that there had ever been a settlement there. It's now farmland and woodland, possibly part of the RSPB reserve to the southeast, also covers Old Kinwick too. No one definitively knows why Kinwick disappeared, but between 1089 and 1332, the place is mentioned in records with 9 different spellings of its name, but they're all similar in making the pronunciation something like Kinmunderswick. I think this shows us that it is a place worth recording, at least 9 mentions over a 250-year period, and possibly the changes in spelling of its name show that it was an evolving place with an evolving community. Then there's a lone reference to Kinwick in 1535. Its spelling is now the simpler Kinwick. The entry is about land rather than a settlement. And then in 1804, the field is mentioned again as Kinwick Field. The lack of records for the settlement after 1332 really sets off Black Death alarm bells. I suspect, and I believe various county historians also have concluded, that the plague hit Kinwick hard, leaving the settlement untenable afterwards. Maybe a few of its inhabitants survived and chose to move to Sutton or Potton, Sandy, or maybe even Biggleswade. We'll never know what really happened. Old Linslade. There is another place further south in Bedfordshire which has an interesting tale to tell about the Black Death. Old Linslade. Modern Linslade can be found as part of Leighton Buzzard. Old Linslade is to the north in the countryside. The Grand Union Canal now snakes around Old Linslade Church and Manor. But back in 1251, the settlement was thriving, or at least trying to thrive. It had a market on a Thursday and a fair held on the 8th of February, granted that year, 1251. It also appears that Old Linslade was renowned for its holy well, which was certainly attracting pilgrims. So from the mid-13th century, it looks like Old Linslade is a town on the rise. Yet just 49 years later, the small town had angered the Bishop of Lincoln, or at least its Linslade vicar Hugh de Hargrave had. And it's the holy well and the funds Vicar Hugh is raising from it which upset the bishop. So much so that the Bishop of Lincoln seeks to suppress the holy well. He forbids pilgrims to visit and for the vicar to raise funds from it. It is a puzzling moment. If it was surely just about the funds being raised, could the bishop not have intervened to scrape some of that money for himself? Or am I being cynical about bishops? Maybe not. I'm going to make an episode later in the autumn or winter about holy wells in Bedfordshire and further afield. And so watch this space because we may be back to examine Linslade's holy well. Sadly, the site of the well was lost to the building of the Grand Union Canal, but its place was remembered and marked on old 19th century maps, which seems odd for a well that was suppressed. Maybe its legacy lasted far longer than the Bishop of Lincoln could have guessed, and the local archaeology group, Leighton Buzzard District Archaeology and Historical Society, have been carrying out some digs and other surveys at the site and have found some intriguing items, such as 13th century pottery and a coin from the same era. By 1342, the arable land around Old Linslade, though, is not producing a good yield, possibly due to the soil being depleted. By 1377, the manor is described as in ruins. The fields are only sown every other year, and much of the land is described as marsh. It is suspected that Old Linslade was another victim of the Black Death in 1349, though it clearly was already in decline. Did the Bishop of Lincoln sound the death knell for the town when he suppressed the holy well? Or was the well itself a last-ditch attempt to bring prosperity to a settlement that was already failing? It's thought that those who survived the plague moved south to other settlements. Intriguingly, the old church was rebuilt in the 15th century. This could imply that it was falling into ruin through disuse, but then who was it repaired for if the settlement was in ruins and unproductive? I think it's fair to say that the limited evidence we have for the Black Death in Bedfordshire is still compelling, though. We have towns like Toddington, Biggleswade and Leighton Buzzard whose vicars, often multiple vicars, die during 1349. We have settlements abandoned and left to ruin around the same time, and these settlements, Cainhoe, Kinwick and Old Linslade, may well have been feeling pressure before the plague arrived. Maybe they were just too small to survive after losing up to possibly more than half their inhabitants. They were also places with nearby settlements that could and did absorb the displaced. Where Cainhoe dwindled, Clophill grew, for example. If you were a survivor of the Black Death, what must it have been like to witness crops in fields left to rot, houses left empty and ruined, churches still and silent on a Sunday, graveyards stinking of death, and families and neighbourhoods torn apart in loss? The landscape was transformed. Ghost villages hunched amongst untamed meadows. The world must have seemed so much more empty. Your place in it so much more fragile. If you survived the Black Death in a world struggling to cope, would it have felt like a blessing? It's not a surprise that so many felt they were approaching the end of days, the apocalypse. Many must have questioned why they survived. Today, we're beginning to unlock the answers to why some people survived the plague. Geneticists, including Jennifer Klunk and Hendrik Poynar, have been analysing the ancient DNA of skeletons found in plague pits and graveyards in London and in Denmark. Then they have compared and contrasted their findings against skeletons of those who outlived the plague. They wanted to discover any differences between those who the plague killed and those who managed to escape it. And what they found was so interesting. They found a gene variant which increased the chance of surviving the Black Death by 40%. As those with this variant were more likely to survive, the number of people with this gene variant grew as they had children and passed on this increased immunity, so that subsequent outbreaks of the plague, though terrible and deadly, were not as catastrophic as the 1349 pandemic. It's an example of natural selection happening over a very short period of time, and a period of time that the scientists can measure. It's got the geneticists really excited. And even more fascinating is that this variant is still found today in our population. Around 45% of British people have this gene variant. It is also linked, though, to a higher risk of developing autoimmune conditions like Crohn's or rheumatoid arthritis. So it protects against the plague, but leaves you possibly susceptible to other health conditions. It's why I chose in the opening dramatic story to have Joan's sister and niece survive the plague. In my imagination, they had this gene variant. It would not have protected all of the family, but it would have protected some. There is so much more I could have covered in this episode about the Black Death. I really wanted to talk about Charterhouse in London and its links to the plague. It has some terrifying ghost stories which date back to the Black Death. As I mentioned earlier, I will come back to the subject and look at other outbreaks during later centuries and in different parts of the country. As well as Charterhouse in London, I would love to cover the Derbyshire plague village of Eyam, which I visited many times as a child and teenager, and Edinburgh's plague history, including Mary King's Close, another place I've visited at least twice and I really love. So if you know of any interesting history, folk tales or ghost stories associated with the plague, please do get in touch. You can contact me on social media or email me at weirdinthewade@gmail.com. I am so grateful to Daniel for his expertise in this episode. Clophill Lakes and Cainhoe Castle are open to visits daily. I'll share information on the show blog, weirdinthewade.blog, about how to visit. I'll also share on the blog information about the Black Death, the science and archaeology that I've discussed today in the episode, as well as the history. And don't forget that next time I'll be exploring more of Bedfordshire's abandoned buildings, this time modern abandoned buildings, or at least more modern, since the 19th century. I'll be looking at creepy tales associated with them, from a crumbling part of Bedford's hospital to another settlement close to Biggleswade, once larger than Biggleswade, that disappeared gradually until a fire took its last remnants 70 years ago. I'll also investigate an abandoned farm with Steph Lay from City of Secrets project over at Milton Keynes. If you'd like to know more about Cainhoe Castle's history and visit the site, then why not sign up for one of Brian Bland's guided tours? Yes, friend of the show Brian Bland from Ampthill Hill Ghost Walks runs guided history walks at Cainhoe Castle. The next one is on Saturday the 15th of August, and there's a link for more information in the show description and on the blog, weirdinthewade.blog. Now, in case you missed it, I was a guest on the brilliant Caught Up in Crime podcast a couple of weeks ago. Tom from Caught Up in Crime visited me in Biggleswade and we recorded an episode about the pot and poisoner and why at the heart of most good ghost stories there's a terrible crime. I'll link to the episode on the show description and on the show blog. His podcast is a really different take on true crime, and I'm sure you will find it fascinating. Now, I did promise some recommendations for the Edinburgh Fringe, so if you're lucky enough to be in Edinburgh over the summer, here they are. Firstly, Emily L. Watts, who has played a number of characters in the dramatic introductions to Weird in the Wade, is part of a show at the Fringe this year. She is part of Kevin the Musical, a satirical musical described as High School Musical on crack. Now, that's a description that's got my attention. The show blurb says that the musical explores themes such as racism, mental illness, gun control, radicalisation and misogyny. Kevin the Musical has never been more relevant than right now. And it's on from the 24th until the 29th of August at Greenside at George Street, venue 236 at the Fringe. I want to wish Emily and the whole cast and crew a wonderful Edinburgh Fringe. Break a leg. The other show I wanted to recommend to you, if you're lucky enough to get to Edinburgh, is The Vampire Run by Jonathan Laurie, a show I was lucky enough to see at Bedford Fringe a couple of weeks ago. It's a choose-your-own-adventure vampire story mashup, which does involve some audience participation, but only if you want to be involved. No one forces you to take part. You can just sit back and watch from the sidelines. It was hilarious and so much fun. I did take part. And so if you're in Edinburgh between the 12th and the 30th of August, do check out Jonathan's show, Vampire Run, and other comedy that he's involved with at the Home Bar. Thank you for listening to Weird in the Wade. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Extra editing in this episode was by Tess Savagir, and the theme music is also by Tess Savagir.
I'm not giving up.
I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either gonna be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
Still waiting in line? Again? That's time you'll never get back. Save time and money with Stamps.com. Over 4 million businesses have skipped the line with Stamps.com. Join them to save up to 90% off carrier rates from your computer or phone right now. Print postage for certified mail, registered mail, and packages in seconds. Then schedule a pickup right from your home or office. For a limited time, go to Stamps.com and use code PODCAST for a free welcome gift. Taxes and fees apply.